13 this morning, Genesis chapters 11 through 13. Before we begin, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. God, we recognize you as the creator of all the universe, and because of that, we worship you and we adore you and we respect you. We also worship you, Lord, and respect you because you are a God of promises, and you are a God that always keeps your promises. And we thank you that you have allowed us to have the Bible that we can read and know that you are a God who loves us and will do what he says he will do. Help us today as we study from the beginning of the life of Abraham, that we will learn what you would have us to learn, that it will increase our faith and trust in you, and that we will be able to please you in all that we do. We pray, Lord, that you'll get glory from our lives and get glory from our time together this morning. Through Jesus we pray. Amen. All right, so if you do have a response to a question, you have an answer for us, we ask that you raise your hand. They'll get a microphone to you, and we do ask that you speak directly into the microphone so that everybody who is watching this at home and those who might watch it later will be able to hear your comments, as well as those of us who are in the auditorium, because sometimes if you have somebody that speaks softly, you can't be heard even in the auditorium. So I want to go back and look at this division of the book that we looked at the very beginning, just to sort of show you why this is a very important topic. There are two ways to divide up the book of Genesis. One is in sections, chapters 1 through 11, which is talking about primeval man, just the history of how man got here and the history of how all life started. And then in chapter 12, you see a shift in the book where the book starts following one particular family. So from 12 down through 50, the end of the book, you will follow Abraham's descendants that leads eventually to Christ. That's the whole point of God giving us this book. So if you look at the first way that this is divided up, you'll see that we're going to be ending the first section today and starting the second section, which means this is an important transition in our study. The second way that the book can be divided up is into 10 different sections, which all start with, this is the history of, or this is the genealogy of. And you'll notice, as I have down there at the bottom, the times in which this happens, which we'll look at these a little bit later in a little bit more detail. But if you look in chapter 10 and verse 1 was one that Brian talked about on Wednesday, but 11 and verse 10 and 11 and verse 27 both start with, this is a genealogy of. So you have 2 of the 10 sections in the book are started in what we're going to be studying today. And if you notice in Genesis chapter 11 and verse 27, there's a huge gap till you get to Genesis chapter 25 and verse 12. So he's going to be introducing a very big section of the book. So what we are going to talk about today is an introduction to what he's going to continue to talk about from chapter 11 and verse 27 all the way down to 25 and verse 12. So sometimes we need to just take a step back and look at the overall picture of the book of Genesis and make sure that we understand where we are in this. We're ending the first section, starting the second section if you go by the first way of dividing the book. And if you go by the second way of dividing into 10 different sections, we're actually going to talk about 2 of those sections today. And we're going to talk about one of those sections that is the biggest of all of the sections that we talk about. So this map just sort of gives you the breakdown of chapter 10 and how all the nations went their own separate way after the flood. And chapter 11 is going to give a detail, sort of back up a little bit and give a summary. This is sort of a modern day view of that. It shows where those times are today. So a lot of what takes place with the Tower of Babel incident is going to take place. It's going to take place there in modern day Iraq. And if you look at this map, sort of shows you where all the nations went. If you go... I don't have I do have the back book on this one. So this sort of shows you how Ham's descendants goes down to the land of Canaan and over to Egypt. Jephthah's descendants sort of went up into Turkey and Eastern Europe and makes their way into Europe. And then Shem's descendants they stick there in Ur and they go a little bit over towards the Promised Land. And that's the descendants that we're going to be talking about a little bit. And then I want to show you one picture real quick because we're going to talk about the Tower of Babel as we start. This is a picture of the kind of building that probably would have been built by them, envisioned by them, reaching up into heaven. Sometimes when you envision this, you envision a little tower, You know, this small little tower going up into heaven. This is actually one that was built about the time of Abraham in Ur. And so this is the kind of buildings that they would have been building in order to get there. So that takes us to question number one. And question number one is, why was God so upset when the people decided to build a city with a tower whose top is in the heavens, and then what did he do about it? Let's read Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 4. It says, now the whole earth had one language and one speech. Now in chapter 10, he does break down that they had different languages. In chapter 11, he's sort of going back to where they did only have one language. And he's going to follow Shem's descendants a little bit later. So they had one language at this particular time. Verse 2, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heaven. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. So why was God so upset that they set out for this particular task? Raise your hand. We got Randy up here. We got Jason. We got Mary. So we'll work at getting those to you. Randy, it looks like you're going to get the microphone first. It's going to be close, but go ahead, Randy.
Yeah, just like with Eve, it's man attempting to equal himself to God.
Okay.
All it is.
All right, so man's trying to equal himself to God, get up to where God is, be on an even playing field with God, if you will. Jason?
Well, they were supposed to spread out and populate the earth.
Okay.
And they were going exactly against God's intention for them.
Yeah, you remember when they came off the ark, that God gave them specific instructions. In Genesis chapter 9 in verse 1, it says, so God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So God's intention was for them to be fruitful and multiply and to scatter, fill the earth. And when they came to the city, they're like, we don't want to do that. We feel like there's more safety, there's more companionship, we feel more comfortable staying in where we are. So instead of doing what God tells us to do, we are going to do what we want to do. And we're going to stay here, and we're going to build this tower, and we're going to have one place to live. And I think that is a major reason why they weren't able to do this. All right. Yes, brother.
Yeah, I think it's, I was thinking about it two ways, actually. If they had succeeded in that, it would have ended up, no doubt, being a mass place for idolatry. And we know that that's, if there was such a thing as it's the greatest sin in God's eyes, it would be idolatry. The other thing in verse 4, it says their purpose, the reason why they said, unless we be scattered abroad. And that's exactly what God did to them.
Yes. So when we find out what God does to them, which is this is almost uniform through Scripture. When man says, I'm not going to do what God says because I don't like what God says, God says, yeah, you are going to do what I say, and I'm going to get the result from what I want. So the very thing, we don't want to be scattered. What does God do? He scatters them. He says, I don't care what you want. I'm going to do I'm going to make sure what happens is what I want to happen. Mary?
I agree with all the previous speakers. They wanted to make themselves a name rather than call on his name, and that's tower is just a memorial to self-sufficiency.
Okay, you have some pride here that we want to make a name for ourselves and trust, and instead of trusting God to make a name for us. Now, there's going to be a huge contrast with Abraham, because what does God tell Abraham? I will make your name great. So here they are, want to make a name for themselves, figure out how to make our own name, and God says, no, it doesn't work that way. If I don't make your name great, your name's not going to be great. And they wanted to go about it that way. So a couple other things. They were relying on their own abilities. We have no indication that, it's not like they asked God, hey, God, you know what? We want to build this tower so we can be closer to you. What do you think about that? They didn't even consider God at all in this. They were relying upon themselves, their own talented society. And they were a talented society. Sometimes we think of ancient societies as being backwards and they don't know anything. There are all kinds of things that have been done in history that when you look at in great detail, you're like, those guys were a lot more advanced than we thought they were. And these were advanced people. They knew how to make bricks when they didn't have stones. They knew how to make those bricks last for a long time. I saw something recently and I didn't dive into it too deeply, but it said they're looking at some of the ancient concrete that was used in Egypt. And that the way that they built things in Egypt is that they heated up the concrete. And heating up the concrete had a reaction in the chemicals that actually made it stronger. And so one guy is saying, let's go back and do it that way because we have things that happened 4,000 years ago. We still see them there because they knew something that maybe we have forgotten. But they were relying upon this. They had asphalt. I showed you the pictures. In modern day Iraq, tar, oil, petroleum, they had that there that they could use as the mortar, and they were relying upon that. And then the purpose. They wanted to build a name for themselves. It wasn't necessarily to give God glory or give God credit or make God look good. They wanted to build a name for themselves. So what did God do about it, which is the second part of that question? What did God do about it? Raise your hand. Do you have an answer for that? All right, Jason's going to give us the answer. Sometimes the answers are really easy, and sometimes they require a little more thought.
He executed his will.
Did what?
He executed his will. He changed their circumstance such that they had almost no choice.
And what was that? What did he do? Just say it.
He divided their language.
He made them speak different languages. And this is always a fun story to tell with kids, right? Because you're talking to kids, and maybe you start a task, and you're building something, and you're giving them instructions, and then all of a sudden, they look at you waiting for the next instructions, and you just start speaking gibberish. And they look at you like, what? And then you have, and they know that they can't get this accomplished because we don't understand what you're saying. And so when they weren't willing to do what God told them to do, scatter about, and they wanted to stay in one place for their own safety, their own security, to build a name for themselves, God says that's not going to happen. And so what he does is he confuses their languages so they can't communicate and carry out this task that they set to carry out. Brian?
Yeah, I think it's also interesting how the text mentions how the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. It's like they think this tower is just so great and it's so huge and we're so awesome, but the Lord has to condescend to come way down to their level and say, what's going on down here on this tiny little, tower that you guys built? It's kind of pathetic, So it's kind of like a slap in the face to their pride of being like God. You're not even close to like God. God has to come down just to see what you're doing.
Yeah, the estimates are maybe they made it 100 feet up. And you think about, first of all, God doesn't come down because God doesn't know what's going on. Okay, he doesn't come down because he's confused. Hey, what's going on down there? I better go down and check it out. I think it is this, I'm going to come down and just show you how worthless or how futile your attempts are going to be in building this. 100 feet, that's not very high. And even our efforts today, it's huge skyscrapers, right? How close are they to, if they were making skyscrapers to see God or be close to God, how close would they be? Not very close, right? So I think there is this, he comes there, what you're doing is not very impressive. And at some level, it's not very impressive. Compared to me, it's not very impressive. But I think at the same time, he did realize that his creation had a lot of potential. Because what does he say in this that makes you understand that he says, all right, they do have a lot of potential. I've created some, what I created was good. He says, if I don't stop them, there's nothing going to be what they can't do. And you think about this for a second. Are you amazed by what men can do? I am totally amazed. And it doesn't take much to amaze me because I can't do very much. And so you think about just the gas engine. Who thought of that? Who was able to come up with that? And you think about computers and you think about our phones and how we're able to hear somebody on the other side of the world like that. Have you ever sent an email to yourself and before you can turn around, it's already there? You're like, how did that happen? I mean, how did it go through all of that to come back to my computer and ding in my computer like that? And you look at how the telescopes that we send out into outer space, you look at all the things that men can do, And it is pretty impressive. But who should we be impressed by when we see that? And I think this is the big difference there. We're impressed by God, that God can create man with such an ability to figure things out. But then when you look at the story of the Tower of Babel, you look at how they thought they had everything figured out, and they could go all the way to the sky to see God. Everything that we know, we looked at this with the basketball example in creation, right? We had the basketball, this is everything there is to know about creation. We made one little dot on it. That's what man knows about creation. Even what we're able to accomplish today, God knows it all, right? He knows it all. And even though our accomplishments are good and great, and we can be amazed by those, if we're amazed by the people instead of being amazed by God, we're going to miss the whole point. And God says, even those amazing accomplishments are nothing compared to what I was able to accomplish. Jason?
Well, I'll use the human body, right? We have fields of medicine studying various sections of the human body, and we have learned so much, and we've learned how amazing that human body is, so much so that we can repair it, we can source problems. And when we start thinking how smart we are, just in terms of the human body, think about this. God spoke it into existence. He didn't build it. He didn't make it. He spoke it into existence. And then when you get beyond the human body and look beyond this world, you look at the stars and the planets and the galaxies and places that we can't even reach with rockets. God spoke that into existence too. And I think that's the kind of point that he's making here, is that you have great potential. You have great ability to learn and figure things out. But the things we are figuring out, God simply spoke into existence.
He gives us the ability to figure out enough that we should say, wow. Right? Wow, God is amazing, right? And that's the whole point. When we see these things, just like we could talk about the human eye probably, or just eyes of all the different animals that God made, and the eyes of the human being, many, many classes, and just how unique that is. But as Jason pointed out, it's not only that God spoke it into existence, but he thought of it. You know, he thought of it to begin with. And one of the incredible things about God is not only the big universe. Sometimes we want to focus on the bigness of the universe, and we want to see how many millions of light years. We got a comment over there. How many, Phil? We have how many millions of light years, or billions of light years, how big it is. But God is equally amazing in the details of his creation. And when you take something so small and figure out, this big God thought about all the details. He left nothing to chance. Everything was perfectly created down to the power in an atom. You know, it's just incredible. Phil?
Yeah, I love this story for a lot of reasons, but it says so much about us, but more about who God is. You know, Jason mentioned that God just spoke it into existence, but the real question is, why did he do that? Why did he even speak it into existence? Man looks at what he wants to do, and it's always something about himself. It's never really anything about God. If you look through history, that's what the Bible records. Man is not impressed with God. Man loses that sense of his awe and his wonder and his mystery. And we should be, you know, and because of that, it tends to make us want to be competitive and want to prove ourselves. Well, you may have made us, but look what we can do. And I think rather than have that kind of mindset, which is why I think God was upset, God was saying, look, I didn't make you to build an altar to yourself to show me how good you are. I want you to know how great I am. One of the greatest mysteries that man will struggle with his whole life is not that the fact that he was made, that God said, I'm going to make you, and I'm going to make you for myself. But the real question is, and we know God loves us, but he doesn't really tell us the why he did that. We have a reason for everything that we do, and it usually boils back to me or you. It doesn't boil back to him. God created us, and he loves us, but he doesn't really give us the reason why. And I think man wants to prove himself and prove his love in these ways, you know, as an example.
And prove that he's worthy. We're worthy of the love of God. We're worthy of what he's done for us. Great points. So let's go ahead and go to question number 2, and that is, why did Moses record Shem and Terah's genealogy in chapter 11? What did you guys come up with that? Why is it here? We noticed that there's 2 genealogies mentioned here. It's a pretty important section. Why does God do this? He's really picking up where he left off in chapter 10 and verse 21. In chapter 10, he sort of goes through the two other genealogies instead of Shem's. He stops at Shem's and he points out that this is the time when all the world had one language. Then he drops down to chapter 11 and tells you what that was about. And now you've already traced two other genealogies down a little bit further. And so now he's tracing Shem's genealogy. Why is this so important? All right, Mary has something. Anybody else, if you have something, raise your hand, because if no one else is going to raise their hand after Mary's comment, I'm going to tell you what I think.
Well, since last time we looked at the contrast between two genealogies of Cain and Seth, or Shem. Well, Ham and Shem. Anyway, there's a big contrast here, and maybe that's the reason, because the Abraham's, the genealogy of Abraham, people are traveling in that. They are scattering. They are going to a place away from home. And then the tower builders wanted to stay in one place and huddle and be, not go to a strange place and grow there and do what God wanted to.
Okay, so a contrast between descendants of the other two that wants to stay there, and then finally Abraham comes along and he's willing to go wherever God tells him to go. Very, very good. So I want to look at these just briefly with you because I think this is important. Hopefully you can see some of that. In these genealogies, I think there's always a break between the genealogies. So you have Genesis chapter 2, which talks about this is the history of the heavens and the earth, and then you have Cain killing Abel. And then pre-flood, Genesis chapter 5 and verse 1, the genealogy of Noah, and then you have post-flood, the genealogy of Noah again. So it seems like these genealogies are all mentioned at a perfect time to show that there's something major has happened here. There's a major shift. Now you have the flood. Now you have a list of genealogies again. And then you have the Tower of Babel. And then he says after the Tower of Babel, he's going to give us two specific genealogies. And if you go all the way to Genesis chapter 25, he doesn't give another genealogy until you have the conflict between Ishmael and Isaac. Now, I got to explain this to you. And so he gives more genealogies, and then you don't have genealogies again until you get Jacob and Esau. I got to explain this again. Here are the descendants of Esau, and here are the descendants of Jacob. So each one time that God gives this, he's sort of showing where all these people have come from. And I think the primary reason he's doing this, or one of the primary reasons he's doing this, is to let us know, as Brian pointed out on Wednesday, that really God is the God of everyone. There's only one God. And he's preparing them to get to where they're going. Who's our original audience, remember? It's the children of Israel who are getting ready to go into the land of Canaan. Right? Moses probably puts these books together during the wilderness wandering, and so they're getting ready to go in. And who they just left? They just left Ham's descendants, right, in Egypt. They saw all these different gods. Now they're going to see more Ham's descendants in the land of Canaan and all the gods that are going. So God's going to explain this and say there was a time when Ham knew who God was. And so his descendants really should be serving God. There was a time where Japheth, although Japheth, he goes up north, he doesn't get a lot of attention, but they knew who God was. And so one of the reasons is, look, I am the God of all the people. And as you go into the land of Canaan, they've forgotten me. Don't forget me like they did. And as a matter of fact, they forgot me so much that they have gone back and they're not even serving gods. They're serving other gods instead of the one God that they should serve. Now, we know that everybody is without excuse when it comes to serving God because of what we learned in chapters 1 through 3, creation, right? Creation tells us there's a God, and we are without excuse in that. So let's go to the next question, question number 3. What promises did God make to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3? What would they have meant to Abraham and the first readers of the book, and what significance do they have to us? But before we get into that, I think it is remarkable here. We're not going to have time to talk too much about this, but what does God ask Abraham to do? Leave. Leave your family and go to a land where you don't know anybody. A land that I'm going to show you, that I'm going to give to your descendants as an inheritance. I always just shake my head when I hear people say, I'm not going to do something. Yeah, people, I would never leave my family. I've heard people say that. I love my family too much. I would never leave my family. Well, if God tells you to, you should, right? If God tells you, you should never have that attitude that I will never do this, because Abraham did not have that attitude. And he's praised for this in Hebrews chapter 11. By faith he obeyed when he called to go out to a place where he would receive an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. So the idea that Abraham left, now Terah left Ur with his family, and they settled in Haran, right? And now God's telling him to leave. But that is an amazing thing that Abraham did in all of this. Now, what promises did he give Abraham? There's several of them. Maybe this is too... I think if we don't have microphones, these questions are a little smoother. If you have to wait for a microphone and it's an easy answer, you're like, I'm not going to wait for a microphone for that. And so maybe it's better off if I just tell you what they are. So we tend to narrow them down into three, but there's a lot more than three. First of all, he says, I will make you a great nation. Now, what's significant about that? Sarah's barren, right? Sarah can't have children. And then when he makes that promise, I'm going to make you a great nation. And Abraham knows that Sarah is barren. And then he says, I will bless you. That's 2. I will make your name great. Goes to the contrast of them trying to make their own name great, the Tower of Babel. And then number 4, that Abraham was to be a blessing. Number 5, that I will bless those who bless you. Number 6, I will curse those who curse you. And then in you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And what we're going to see is God takes some of these promises and start showing him how that's coming about right away. So that he builds his faith in some of these bigger promises of having a great nation and eventually blessing the entire world. Abraham, what would have been his focus on these promises, do you think? Well, look at his focus, what he would have been focusing in on, and what the first readers would have been thinking about, and then what we think about. Hopefully, did you guys get the emails that I sent out with all these questions on there? Okay, just making sure. Now we have 2 up here, Brian and Mary. We'll talk about Abraham first, Abram. And I felt bad about it. I think I'm not going to be able to say Abram the whole time. And then I thought, the Bible after this always refers to him as Abraham. So if I refer to him as Abraham all the time, it's okay. Brian?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it would have struck Abraham as impossible. How can you make me a great nation if my wife is barren? But like you said, with the original readers of the book, Israel, and they're like, oh man, like that's exactly, God did keep that promise. He brought us out of Egypt. He promised in Exodus 19, like, you are now my holy nation, he says, the people of my own possession. So they're already seeing these things come to fruition.
Yeah, so I go ahead, Mary. And then.
I think Brian covered it.
Okay. So I think one of the things with Abraham is, I can't say exactly what Abraham was focused on, but I'm just going to say if I were Abraham and I got all 7 of these promises, I might be thinking primarily of the most immediate ones. All right, show me the immediate stuff, blessing me, right? I want to see that blessing part of it. And my mind may not have been so far out into the future to see all the big things. The first readers would have looked back and said, look at what God did for Abraham. He did bless Abraham. He did bless those who blessed Abraham. He did curse those who cursed Abraham. And so that God who is taking us to the promised land is a God that we can trust. He's going to keep these other promises, like giving us a land to live in that he promised. So because God kept these small promises, I can trust him to keep the big promises. And I don't think that's a mistake in God's part. God knows the creation better than anyone. And it's sort of like he gives us these little deposits of his that we can trust him. And it's just an important part of it, though, because I need those. Don't you need those? Don't you need to see the small things occasionally and to have more faith in the big things that God is able to do? And I think that's what he's going to do with Abraham as it approaches and it comes out next. Remember, Abraham was 75 years old when he left the land and started going this way. And his wife was barren, and God makes these promises to him. He goes down to Shechem, and then he goes to Bethel, and he builds an altar there, and he continues to travel south going forward. So question number 4, what, if anything, did Abram do wrong when he went down to Egypt when there was a famine? So he goes down to Shechem, and now there's a famine in the land, and then he goes down to Egypt. What, if anything, did Abram do wrong when there was a famine in the land of Canaan? Now this one, surely some of you have some things to say about this. All right. Up here, now we have all kinds of hands going up. All right. Cindy, and then we have a couple up here. You want to get Cindy? Randy, go ahead. All right, you go ahead. Terry, you got the mic.
Okay.
Go.
There's no indication that God told Abram to go to the land that he's going to show him, which would be the land of Canaan. There's no indication that God told him to leave Canaan and go to Egypt. It seems like Abram just kind of did that on his own.
All right, I think that's the first thing. There's no indication that God told him to do this. And there's no indication that he asked God. Abraham or Abram was probably an A-type personality, right? And so he sees a famine and he says, how do I solve this problem? Well, I go to Egypt. Now, what does God need from Abram? If you have an A-type personality, that's great. I mean, the world needs people with that personality. But what weakness might that personality present you with? Thinking you can figure it out on your own, right? And not trust God. And that's sort of where God is with Abraham here. Abraham thinks he can figure it out on his own. And so he doesn't ask God, which is a mistake as he starts out. Okay, Cindy?
Following that is that he deceived Pharaoh by, even deceiving and having Sarah go in with the lie.
Okay.
That's what it was a lie.
Yes.
That Sarah was his sister and not his wife.
Yeah, so he goes in. It's not just that he lied. It's that he made a plan with Sarah to lie. It's like they planned this whole thing out in order to lie. And so it's almost like he has this great plan. He goes down to Egypt and goes, all right, let's just, this one detail we got to make sure that we're on the same page. And if they ask who you are, tell them that you are my sister, not my wife. All right, good. We got it all set. Nothing's going to go wrong, man. This is a perfect plan. We got it all worked out. Because you think about this for a second. I think there was a safety net here in Abraham's mind. If somebody wanted to marry Sarah, who would they have to ask? Abram. So he goes, I got this all figured out. So somebody wants to marry you, they have to come ask my permission because you don't have a father here. So when they come ask my permission, I'll just tell them, no, you can't marry her, and everything's going to be good. Now, what he didn't foresee in this is Pharaoh. Does Pharaoh need anyone's permission? No. So now he's in the biggest trouble that he could possibly be in, because the one thing he didn't think about how his plan could fail, God made it happen. All right, now she's in Pharaoh's household. I also think this is so interesting. Sarah must have been, she's older, but she's so attractive that the princes of the day, they dare not marry her. What happens if you marry someone prettier than all Pharaoh's wives? That could be a little bit of a trouble. So they see her and say, all right, she's too pretty for me. She's too pretty for you too. And we better go tell Pharaoh about her. And so Pharaoh takes her into his own self. So not only did he not ask God's permission to go, and God didn't tell him to go, he makes this pre-planned lie. And if you go back even earlier to Genesis chapter 20, it seems like this lie was planned out from the very beginning, before they left Ur, before they left. It was not something that when he first going into Egypt, it's sort of just a reminder of what they already agreed upon when they first left. Randy?
Well, yeah, that was pretty much my point too. And it also is interesting that you've got Abraham who left when he was 75 from his home and shows so much faith, and yet at this point shows such a lack of faith that God would protect him and Sarah. And it shows that humanity as well. We struggle with the same things. And like you were saying, it's those little things we see we have to have. And sometimes we stumble over those because that's the immediate. Here I am with Sarah in this land, and he's forgetting the bigger picture of God has made these promises.
Yeah, so I think that's a huge benefit he gives us in Scripture is even the person who's known as the father of faith didn't always have it. He had to grow in that. And God was patient with him as he grew in that. And it helps us to know that, yeah, sometimes we don't have the faith that we should, and I'm not making excuses for that, but God understands our weaknesses, and he knows that our faith needs to grow over time. If everybody had complete faith as soon as they became a Christian, and they didn't have to grow in that, that would not be God's plan. All right, 2 more comments real quick, Jason, and then Brian.
Well, it goes back to your Lord's Supper talk. Why is it so difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven? It's because folks with riches tend to think and rely on themselves. They don't put their trust in anything else. Mm-hmm. They put their trust in their ability to make money, and they put their trust in that money to take care of them. And so what Abraham did was show a complete abandonment of reliance on God. And what he learned quickly is that I can make the greatest plan in the world, and I'm not going to think of everything. God thinks of everything when he makes his plans.
Yeah, so he's sort of going back to the same mindset of the people who wanted to build the Tower of Babel. I can make this, I can do this on my own. And God says, no, you can't. You have to be different, Abraham, than everybody else. Your thinking has to be different. And so I think God purposely puts him in a bind, in a pickle here, so that he understands, hey, all my thinking, all my planning is not good enough. I have to trust God. Brian?
Yeah, and it's also interesting because earlier in the chapter, one of his promises is that you'll be a blessing. And because he takes things into his own hands, he actually becomes a curse on Egypt instead of a blessing. And it's kind of a neat comparison. Sarah becomes the forbidden tree. His wife, the Egyptians see her, right? You have that Saul language. She's beautiful. They take her, just like Eve takes a tree. So because he disobeys God, he brings the curse of sin into Egypt with him. So it's just a really eye-opening thing that we've got to obey God. Otherwise, we reverse the blessing we're supposed to be to those around us and become a curse.
All right, so when he gets there, and Pharaoh is cursed with plagues because of this. And the land of Egypt is cursed with plagues because of this. All right, Phil, you got a microphone right behind you.
Okay. I don't think we appreciate the position that God put Abraham into at the beginning when he told him to leave his family. It's hard for us to imagine building your whole life and the foundation of your life on your family and being so identified with your family that you don't see anybody else. That's because that's all you have. That's where you find your greatest source of life and identity. All of a sudden now God says, I want to be your foundation, which means you're going to have to let go of all these other things that take that away. I'm going to have to leave one foundation and go to another. That's what faith in God is about. It's starting over with the new foundation.
All right, very good. Good point. So Pharaoh is cursed, Egypt's cursed. He goes to Abram and says, what have you done? Why have you done this to us? And then Abraham doesn't tell him why on this particular occasion. On another occasion, he's going to explain why he did it. But this particular occasion, there's no explanation. And what does Pharaoh do? He says, get out of here. Right? And so where does Abraham go when he leaves? Let's read Genesis 13, 1 through 4. Genesis 13, 1 through 4. Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him to the south. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he went on this journey from the south as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abraham called on the name of the Lord. This is sort of a reboot. Abraham messed up. Abraham messed up by going. He messed up by planning to lie. He messed up by lying. He becomes a curse to Pharaoh. He becomes a curse to Egypt. And so he goes back to where he was when he first entered the promised land and where he built an altar to God. And he says he called upon the name of the Lord. So if you have in your Bibles, you go back to chapter 12 and verse 8. It says, there in Bethel, he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So chapter 12 and verse 8, and here in verse 13 and verse 3, is sort of like two parentheses here. He calls on the name of the Lord when he builds the altar in Bethel. He goes down to Egypt, total disaster. He goes back to Bethel where he built the altar, and he does the same thing. He calls on the name of the Lord, and it's sort of a reboot. Now let's see what happens next. So I just another map here for you to look at. There's where Bethel and Ai are. And when we pick up next, there's this conversation. I hope some of you had a chance to look at the video that I sent you to look at. But question number 5, why was there strife between Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen? I think there's a simple way to put this. Blessing, I will bless you. I'm going to bless you, Abraham. And then what else did he say? I'm going to bless those who bless you. Lot is someone who blessed Abraham. Abraham is someone God blessed. So what's God doing? I think the fact that both of these men are rich and they have all this livestock, they have all this gold, they have all this silver, they even have servants, they have people tending their flocks for them. Both of them are wealthy, and a very simple way of saying that is because God's fulfilling his promise. God is blessing Abraham, and God is blessing Lot as a result of this. So the herdsmen start fighting. There's strife between them. So what does this A-type, in-charge personality Abram do to solve this problem? I'm just going to start randomly calling on people. All right.
Yeah, it says separate. Abraham generously offers Lot the first choice.
All right, so Abram goes to Lot. We're brothers here, right? We're kinsmen. We're related. We're family, as he was pointing out. We don't need to have this problem between us. So I'm going to give you the choice. Go where you want to go, and I'll go the opposite direction. Now, think about it again in reference to the promise. If you're Abram and God has said, I'm going to bless you, does it matter where you go? If you firmly believe that promise, it doesn't matter where you go. So he could go to Lot and say, I think he was being generous in all this, and he was putting other people above himself, but I think he could do that because he trusted God. And I think there's a good point there. How are we able to treat other people properly and be the kind of people that we need to be and be generous? And we have to trust God, right? If we don't trust God, we're never going to do it. We're not going to do it of our own. So Lot looks out to the east, and he sees how it is watered. And the way he describes the land here, two different ways. One, it's like the Garden of Eden. It's all perfect situation for me to be successful. And it's like Egypt. So where did they go when they were in trouble? Because of famine, they go to Egypt. The Nile River's there. There's all kinds of good things. Now, in order to protect myself from famine and other things, I'm going to go in this area of this plain down here that is watered by the Jordan River, and then I'll be safe. But there's a problem with that, and that is that the people in that area weren't believers in God. And they were opposed to God. And they did all kinds of evil against what God would have them to do, so they corrupt him, and we'll see that later on as we go on from that. So let's read chapter 13, 14 through 17. So after they divide, it says, and the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see, I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. So when you think about this, Sarah's still barren, right? Lot took the best property. All the descendants of Ham are in the area. And God says, no, you look north, you look south, you look east, you look west. I'm going to give all that to you. And so why don't you go tour the land that I have promised to give you? And our time is up. Questions for Wednesday night, I have those in my office. I will go get those and hand out to you.